Hello, everyone. My name is Elke Weesjes, and today I'll be talking about my book, Growing Up Communist in the Netherlands and Britain, Childhood, Political Activism and Identity Formation, which was published in 2021 by Amsterdam University Press. Now, my talk at the library in June was recorded, but due to some technical issues, we couldn't use it. So hence this second version that I just recorded here at home in New York City. So unfortunately, it doesn't include the vibrant and stimulating discussion that took place afterwards, but feel free to send me questions. My email address is included on the last slide. Now, I'd like to share my screen and start this talk. Let me see. All right, here we go. Let me just see if I can move myself. There we go. Okay, so I'd like to start this talk with a quote from one of my Dutch participants named Mieke. She was born in 1948 in Rotterdam, and looking back on her upbringing, she said, "I never felt as though I lived in two separate worlds. I even went to a Christian club. My mother felt that doing so was important. We also had a Bible at home, one of those thick ones with really thin pages. The Christian club was a children's club, which was part of the Maranatha Church in Overschie. We would first pray, and then we would read from the Bible and sing. Afterwards, we would do fun things. We would make mittens and play games, that kind of stuff. The children from my school went there, so I wanted to go too. My father said, 'Can't you think of anything else?' But my mother said, 'You should go. You'll learn a thing or two.' But I didn't get along with the woman who ran the club because she said that communists were really bad people. I was always fighting with that woman, but I kept on going to the club nonetheless because all my girlfriends were going and we would have a good time together. There was also a Christmas celebration, and at Christmas we would get an orange, and that was such a treat because we didn't have much money at home." End quote. Now, Mieke grew up in Overschie, a neighborhood in Rotterdam. And her mother was raised in a socialist working class family and became involved in the communist resistance during the Second World War. And her father, a carpenter, joined the Communist Party of the Netherlands, or the CPN, in the 1950s. And whilst active and always ready to organize a strike, he was never quite as passionate about communism as Mieke's mother. Now, despite her political dedication, Mieke's mother wanted her daughter to have a normal life, and do what other children did, even if this meant attending a Christian club. And Mieke, who looked up to her mother as an inspiration, recalled that her parents never forced her to join any communist organizations, but she did so anyway, and eventually became very active in her local Communist Party. Her brother, who was, according to Mieke, somewhat embarrassed about his parents' political views, did not join the party, and his decision was respected by the family. Mieke remained a member until the very end, and when the CPN was disbanded in 1991, a large photograph of her and her mother, both crying, was published in the local newspaper. Mieke is one of 38 cradle communists I interviewed for a comparative oral history project about rank and file communist family life in Britain and the Netherlands during the Cold War. And before I talk a little bit more about the book, I want to give you some background information about the project and how it came about. In 2001, I was hired as an intern at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam to work on an oral history project about communist family life in Cold War Holland. My colleague Margreet Schevel and I published our findings in a Dutch academic journal, and I used the interviews for my master's dissertation. I moved to England several years later and decided, as part of my PhD research project at the University of Sussex, to expand on this research. I conducted additional interviews with British cradle communists for a comparative analysis. And lastly, I also analyzed a number of interviews brought together by Phil Cohen in Children of the Revolution. After completing my PhD project, I worked outside of the field of history for several years, first in the Netherlands and then in the United States. And about 5 years ago, I was contacted by Dr. Paul Meisler, who he runs the Department of Labor Studies at the University of Indiana. He's the author of Raising Reds, a book about communist children's organizations in the United States. Meisler had read my thesis and encouraged me to write a book proposal. So after obtaining a book contract with Amsterdam University Press, I decided to re-interview my participants to explore whether their opinions and reflections on their youth had changed over time. So the second round of interviews provided me with a lot of new and exciting material. And based on this new material, I've also published several research papers that explore gender, sexuality, and the cultural aspects of the communist movement. A Dutch nonfiction book based on the Dutch portion of my research will be published next year. So my book is informed by oral history and memory studies and draws on the aforementioned interviews, autobiographies, archival materials, and existing historiography of both movements. And by analyzing the political and non-political aspects of participants' lives, the book interrogates how far Moscow and or indigenous social, political, economic, and cultural factors influenced the experiences and identity formation of communists. And in terms of the latter, comparing two very different countries was necessary, as doing so exposed how communists, their parties, and associated organizations adapted to their national circumstances. Scholars in the field of British communism, such as Kevin Morgan, Gideon Cohen, and Matthew Worley, have urged the international community of communist historians to engage in comparative research. And despite many challenges associated with the comparative approach, including things like language and geography and the availability of comparable sources, these scholars firmly believe that the possibilities and limitations of communism can only be truly understood if compared across different national boundaries. However, until this day, comparative studies remain sparse. So aside from its comparative approach, my book is also distinct in that it uses a child perspective, or rather, the adult memory of childhood experience filtered through time. Children were born into a life rather than choosing it, and as expected, I found them to be less defensive in their responses than their parents. Even those who were initially somewhat distrustful let their guards down during follow-up interviews and shared very intimate details about their upbringing. My book adds nuance to the picture painted by the sociologist Jolande Withuis for the Dutch context and Raphael Samuel for the British context. Examining communist family life and communist mentality from below, these authors have described communists as inflexible, emotionally unavailable, overbearing, and physically unaffectionate. They build up a picture of a group with rigid moral codes and values, whose members deliberately isolated themselves, politically and socially. In my own sample, only 3 Dutch and 2 British participants shared experiences that somewhat match these authors' observations and findings. Over the years, many Dutch participants with positive recollections of their childhood have voiced discontent with the way communist family life has been portrayed in existing literature. Now, these feelings weren't shared by British participants, as British historians have expanded on Samuel's line of inquiry and produced much fuller accounts of communist lives. Most notably, the authors of Communist and British Society have underlined the many variations of local communisms and explored the changing nature of communist interpretations of the ideology and their relationship with Moscow. My book is firmly placed within the latter trend, and rather than contradict, it complements prior studies into communist mentality and identity. After all, there were those among communist parents who were slavishly obedient to their parties, isolated themselves socially, and followed Soviet child-rearing practices to the letter. Yet in my sample, they were a small minority. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about my participants. The majority grew up in cities with relatively large concentrations of communists: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Den Haag, London, Liverpool, and Manchester. They were born between 1932 and 1956, and their parents were part-time communist activists or organizers. Their parents, who generally belonged to the working or lower middle classes, considered themselves to be representatives of the working class, despite the fact they were often much more culturally and politically educated than most members of that class. When using oral history as a methodology, one has to consider, of course, specific challenges, including participants' tendency to be nostalgic and subjective, as well as the fallibility of memory. Memories and our views on past experiences are refashioned by new information, suggestions from others, and by shifts in our emotional state of mind, aging, and the passage of time. The latter became particularly clear during the follow-up interviews, which in certain cases were conducted 18 years after the initial interview. And curiously, male and female participants spoke mostly about their fathers during the initial interview, even when their mothers had also been active in the communist movement. Mothers' political activities generally slowed down when they started families, which most likely explains participants' tendency to focus almost solely on their fathers when reflecting on a communist upbringing. I asked participants to discuss their mothers during the follow-up interviews, and it became clear that their mothers were politically active, much more so than non-communist working class mothers. However, few exceptions aside, they often filled a supportive role, ensuring that their husbands could dedicate their time to politics. That said, when comparing the recollections of British and Dutch cradle communists, it is notable that the level of political activity of Dutch mothers was higher than that of British peers. In Britain, it was usually the husband who recruited his wife into the party, where women were all too often seen as tea and cake makers. On the contrary, in the Netherlands, the majority of participants' mothers were already card-carrying members when they met their husbands. And among them were many who had grown up in communist families and were second or even third generation radical Marxists. They had been members of the Communist Youth League in the 1920s and 30s, or the Communist Resistance, where they first became politically active. Now, before I move on to the book's structure, I'd like to discuss a number of national peculiarities that have defined the British and Dutch communist movements and help explain the discrepancies between the experiences of Dutch and British communists, especially in terms of ideological loyalty, internal cohesion of the movement, hereditary nature of radical thought, and extent of experienced political and social isolation. Based on my participants' testimonies, I found that British communists were more moderate in their outlook, more integrated into the wider labor movement, and more likely to stray ideologically. Dutch communists, on the other hand, were much more rigid in their political views, experienced more social and political isolation, and the post-war Dutch communist movement had a higher degree of internal cohesion. The following factors are decisive in this context. And in my book, I actually discuss these throughout all of the chapters, but I thought for this presentation, it would be very helpful to discuss them in the first few slides. So the first thing is that compared to Britain, there was a much more powerful and influential Orthodox Marxist tradition in the Netherlands. As I already alluded to above, Dutch participants come from very long lines of socialists, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, and communists. Communism, or at least radical thought, was in their blood, so to speak. Now, unlike the majority of Dutch participants who had at least one communist grandparent, the British participants were often only second-generation communists. British parents usually came from a non-political or religious background. Only a very small minority were raised in socialist families. Dutch participants' radical roots, on the other hand, can be traced back as far as the 1880s, with grandparents who supported the anarchist Domela Nieuwenhuis. In this context, it's important to acknowledge that compared to the Netherlands, Britain had industrialized very early. And by the time that large sections of the Dutch working class became influenced by revolutionary ideologies like anarchism and Marxism, the British working class was already firmly anchored in a more moderate socialist tradition. Communism, like anarchism, was unable to get a strong foothold within the British labor movement. On the contrary, despite its small size, the CPN was able to mobilize large, non-communist yet revolutionary sections of the working class. For example, anarcho-syndicalists. Therefore, the CPN, unlike the CPGB, was considered a real threat and was right from its foundation dealt with accordingly, which had obviously an overall isolating effect. Now, the second thing is that related to the latter, it should be noted that the Dutch political landscape has been characterized by segmentation, intensified by a voting system based on proportional representation. In the Netherlands, small parties like the CPN can still have a lot of influence on politics, which is why throughout the 20th century, Dutch authorities were vigilant when it came to Dutch communists and tried to control, undermine, and isolate the CPN as much as possible. Due to Britain's two-party system, it is incredibly difficult for a small party like the CPGB to survive. Naturally, small parties are hardly ever seen as a real threat. The third thing is anti-communism. Anti-communism, obviously as old as the party itself, was much more virulent in the Netherlands than in Britain and intensified during the Cold War. And perhaps surprisingly, and in contrast to the situation in Britain, anti-communist sentiments in the Netherlands were not just widespread among Catholics and Protestants, but also among Social Democrats. And the relationship between Social Democrats and communists had been fraught with suspicion and heated mutual accusations ever since a group of Marxists, Orthodox Marxists, left the Social Democratic Workers' Party in 1909 to establish the Dutch Communist Party's predecessor, the Social Democratic Party. So societal fear and hatred of communists built up after the war, and eventually led to an eruption of physical violence against communists, these are Dutch communists, after the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. Naturally, aside from causing victims to withdraw within their own communities, the shared experience of persecution, first during the Second World War and then again during the Cold War, defined communist identities. The fourth thing, speaking of the war, it goes without saying that the German occupation of the Netherlands left a lasting impact on the Dutch communist movement. Due to the tremendous sacrifices made by communists during the Second World War and parents' personal war trauma, Dutch cradle communists, as compared to their British peers, felt more inclined to join communist organizations, follow the communist ideology, and remain a member of the party, even though their commitment to and faith in communism had waned. Now, the next point is that aside from the Cold War, there is another reason why Dutch communists experienced more political and social isolation than their British counterparts. Until the late 1960s, the Netherlands was characterized by political denominational segregation. This is known as pillarization. Dutch society was divided into 4 pillars: a Catholic, an Orthodox Calvinist, a liberal, and a social democratic pillar. These 4 pillars had their own institutions: newspapers and magazines, broadcasting corporations, trade unions, schools, undertakers, hospitals, building societies, universities, sports clubs and choirs, you name it. They had it all. Every pillar, which united people from all classes, amounted to a subculture within society. As the Cold War intensified in the 1950s, pillars, already not particularly welcoming to outsiders, they closed their ranks to keep communists out. And while some organizations, such as neighborhood sports clubs and a few local religious clubs, such as the one that Mika was part of, were open to all, most organizations only welcomed like-minded people. And due to this situation, Dutch communists were compelled to create their own unofficial pillar with a newspaper, a choir, sports clubs, several youth organizations, a women's organization, magazines for the whole family, a film organization, a publishing house, a union, and camping sites. And within this relative isolation, communists were more likely to adhere to the communist ideology than their British peers, who weren't actively kept out of non-communist cultural organizations, at least not at the same scale. British society was less static, and there was much more interaction between people from different political or religious persuasions. British communists were never banned from joining unions and were able to establish tremendously important working relationships with non-communists within unions and on councils. Still, and this is very important, much like its British equivalent, the Dutch communist movement as a whole was too small to be self-sufficient, and especially its rank and file members and their children interacted with non-communists on a daily basis in their schools and in their neighborhoods. In fact, participants' parents, as you also saw with Mika's story, they encouraged relationships with non-communists and wanted their children to blend in and be normal. So my book is divided into 2 parts. Part 1, chapters 2 to 4, examines and compares the social and political history of the communist youth movements in Britain and the Netherlands. These 3 chapters move chronologically across some 70 years of radical youth activism and explores the relationships of these youth organizations to their respective parties. These chapters, they provide a much needed framework for understanding the political lives of the participants and their parents, and the aforementioned national peculiarities, of course, without rehashing party histories. Unlike the CPGB and the CPN, which history, of course, has featured in countless publications, the communist youth movement in both countries has received little to no academic attention. So this gap is unfortunate, as communist youth organizations and their programs were an important factor in the development of a communist youth culture in Western countries. Paul Meisler has observed that an examination of Communist Party youth activities is like a window into that political culture. In Britain and the Netherlands, these activities were largely organized by the British Young Communist League, the YCL, and its Dutch equivalent, the Algemeen Nederlands Jeugdverbond, the ANJV. It was within these organizations that communist children, including the majority of my participants, were socialized into the values and mores of the communist community. Both leagues provided its members with a community of peers and of course also potential partners, and a place where they could feel safe when anti-communist sentiments flared up. In all, Membership of these youth organizations shaped communist children's political and cultural identity during their formative years. Chapter 2, Under the Party's Wing, looks at the period 1920-1956 and explores the impact of the class against class phase, the Popular Front strategy, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the entry of the Soviet Union into the war on the Allied side, and finally, the Cold War on the popularity of the ANJV and the YCL. And chapter 3, Out of the Shadows, zooms in on the period 1956-1968 and details the ANJV's and the YCL's changing relationship with their respective communist parties as the Cold War began to thaw and their quest for their own identity began. It explores members' successful and not so successful attempts to collaborate with non-communist radical youth on important political issues such as nuclear disarmament, student rights, and the Vietnam War, in a bid to break through their social and political isolation. And lastly, Chapter 4, Fragmentation and Demise, looks at the organization's final years and explores their roles in the feminist, anti-racist, and gay rights movements. So whereas part 1 explores the extent of political isolation of communist youth organizations, part 2, which is chapters 5 to 8, examines the extent of social isolation experienced by communists and their children, and their attempts to mix Soviet ideology and culture with Western values and traditions. This part kicks off with a chapter dedicated to the impact of the Second World War and the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, as these events definitively shaped participants' lives and have informed virtually all of their experiences. This chapter particularly examines how cradle communists in the Netherlands and Britain have experienced the contrast between the communist movement's zenith during the Second World War and then its nadir in 1956. And within this context, it discusses the Dutch communist resistance during the German occupation, parental war trauma and transgenerational communication, and the impact of anti-communist measures in Britain and the Netherlands on participants' lives. The remaining chapters in part 2 explore the private and public life of Dutch and British communists in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and investigate what politics really meant in participants' lives. Chapter 5 explores communist home life and focuses on participants' political and cultural upbringing. It shows the more practical ways in which family time was structured before discussing parental prescriptions and aspirations. What kind of parents did Communist Party members want to be, and were they inspired by Soviet ideology? Were their aspirations fundamentally different from those of non-communist working class parents? Searching for answers to these questions, this particular chapter, which looks specifically at gender roles, sexuality, pedagogical values, and morality, it maps the theory and practice of a communist upbringing and examines the considerable contrast between the two. Chapter 6 discusses communist public life. And Dutch and British communist families were connected with the outside world in many ways. They encountered non-communists at work, in school, in their neighborhood, and through friends and extended family. Because the Dutch and British communist parties were so small, rank and file communists, they couldn't live in a self-sufficient bubble and had to interact and get along with people who did not agree with their political ideas. Now, this chapter, chapter 6, analyzes the issues that arose in the context of these interactions. It discusses participants' experiences in non-communist surroundings, such as their neighborhood, school, workplace, and explores their friendships and their romantic relationships. At the end of each interview, I asked my participants to reflect on their youth and answer the following question. How do you look back on your upbringing? Now, you would say it's a seemingly innocent question that nonetheless released incredibly strong emotions. it became clear that in the context of this question, participants' views were colored by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the atrocities committed in the name of communism that came to light in the aftermath. And what I thought was so interesting is that without being prompted, the majority of participants tried to make a distinction between the communist values they believed in and lived by, and the way communist ideology was interpreted and carried out by Moscow and their respective parties. In terms of their immediate family, participants were understanding and forgiving overall, and they also emphasized that their parents were good people who tried their hardest to change society and who really cared about the underdog, but were unfortunately led by the Soviet Union in their struggle. Betsy, who was born in 1944 and grew up in Den Haag, remarked, "My parents tried to teach me solidarity. I was very disappointed with communism. All those ideas I grew up with, they didn't even work in the Soviet Union. That's a slap in the face. My dad was so terribly disappointed. He had worked for the good cause his whole life. But that feeling of solidarity is something that I pass on to my own children. I'm not very materialistic either, even though I live in a nice house. Don't be selfish. When I look back, I have to say I did enjoy my childhood, and I have no regrets whatsoever about being a communist." End quote. Cradle communists interviewed in Children of the Revolution shared similar feelings when looking back on their childhood. Alexa Sale, for example, remarked, quote, "My parents were amazingly liberal with a tremendous sense of personal freedom, and that has passed on. I do have to say about my parents that they were lovely and wonderful people, and my dad still is. They did wonderful things for me, but they got it wrong about the Soviet Union." End quote. A few respondents were less forgiving and found it hard to cope with certain features of their upbringing. They looked back and judged their parents' political outlook as narrow-minded and binarized. And some felt in hindsight that they grew up with a lie. Marieke noted, for example, quote, "I think to myself, God damn, was I really part of that? I am very embarrassed. Nothing was true. It was all lies. I was an emotional wreck. Everything that came to the surface about the CPN in 1989, we felt so superior for all those years. I put so much time and effort in it, and it was in vain." End quote. Now, Marike's sense of disappointment was felt by other participants too, but mostly by participants' parents. According to the participants, parents expressed anger because they had been wrong and disappointment because they had been lied to. The psychological impact of the collapse of international communism on the lives of rank and file communists has not really received much academic attention. Nevertheless, based on participants' accounts, we can assume that many faithful followers of the communist ideology felt confused, upset, angry, and disappointed. Phil Cohen notes that the Communist Party culture can be seen as in a semi-religious context. Considering the level of commitment and faith required from communists, this analogy might help outsiders understand, quote, "why sincere and intelligent people suspend their critical faculties for so long, both in supporting foreign leaders and regimes that were so evidently not worthy of support, and believing that British people would eventually see the light and vote for them," end quote. This analogy also enables us to imagine the impact of the collapse of communism. It can be best compared to a sense of loss a faithful Christian would experience when he or she realizes that God does not exist and there is no such thing as heaven. Whereas the majority of parents faced and dealt with the fact that they were wrong about the Soviet Union, some parents were stubborn and could not admit that mistakes were made by the Soviet Union in general and Stalin in specific. Pete, who was born in 1942 and grew up in Den Haag, remarked, quote, "Communism collapsed, but my father was too stubborn to admit it. Gorbachev has lost his marbles and Yeltsin is a crook." He didn't want to talk about anything. Khrushchev and his revelations about Stalin, nothing. He continued to believe that the Soviet Union was a decent society, end quote. Other parents had separated the Soviet Union from their own ideology to such an extent that they didn't feel responsible for Soviet mistakes. Julia, who was born in 1934 and grew up in London, said, quote, "I never seen my father embarrassed about his beliefs, and I don't even think he had any regrets. He felt it was of his time. He was caught up with the circumstances of his time. I think my father felt that there should be a revolution, but he didn't feel it was actually going to happen. I've never heard my father condemn the Soviet Union. In his mind, it wasn't necessary to do so. He believed in his ideals until he died. The fact that the Soviet Union had not executed the ideals, done things in the right way, didn't mean the ideology was wrong," end quote. Making peace with one's upbringing and parents' political beliefs is much more difficult when parents like Pete's stepfather continue to believe that the Soviet Union had done no wrong. One British participant who requested this particular comment remained completely anonymous, likened her mother's undying loyalty to Stalin and unwillingness to acknowledge and condemn Soviet crimes to denying the Holocaust. She said, "Looking back, I felt I grew up with a bit of a lie. I must admit, I have not had this conversation with them recently because it got too difficult. But my mother still seems to believe in Stalin. I cannot understand this. I'm afraid she's too important to me to have a blazing row about it. But I do not understand that someone so intelligent can think this way. To me, it is almost like people who deny the Holocaust. I am not sure if my father feels the same. It is always my mother who expresses these very strong views. I therefore suspect he doesn't feel as strongly. He is not going to upset my mother. It is in the past and we must move on. It doesn't really affect me. It was only a part of what I grew up with. But the impact the disintegration of communism had on my parents, like other people in the party, was severe," end quote. So in my book, I've loosely divided participants' parents, so this is a subdivision, into three groups: militant communists, ordinary communists, and bohemian communists. These three groups mourned the collapse of communism differently. Whereas militant communists stubbornly held on to their belief that the Soviet Union and the international communist movement were on the right side of history, ordinary rank-and-file communists struggled with a sense of loss and often blamed themselves for getting it wrong, whilst the last category found it much easier to let go and move on, as they had never been rigid followers of Moscow and or their party in the first place. So Bram's parents were an example of bohemian communists. He recalled that his parents had a much looser interpretation of the communist ideology and cherry-picked whatever worked for them. He said, quote, "At home, we didn't have much to do with the Soviet Union. Therefore, the news or instructions that came out of the Soviet Union didn't really influence my parents' political thoughts. At a certain point, the Soviet Union banned abstract painting. My dad, an artist, painted abstract art and never even considered ceasing making abstract art because the Soviet Union said so. But it wasn't a reason to turn his back on communism either. They never left the party, but to them, communism as an ideology had already fizzled out when the party was discontinued," end quote. And Bram's parents weren't alone. Other parents too were only members on paper by the time their parties disbanded. However, for most communist families, the impact of the disintegration of communism was severe. Participants recalled being aware of the pain it caused, and out of respect for their parents, they chose not to talk about it and focus on the good things instead. Lucy recalled, quote, "Reflecting on a communist upbringing, I try to be as free of prejudice as I can be. I stay clear of any stereotyping of any groups of people. It makes me sick that some people who call themselves liberals do this. Secondly, I guess that my campaigning instinct for the underdog is a result of a communist upbringing," end quote. Lucy's comments here are exemplary for the majority of both British and Dutch participants. Looking back on the positive aspects of their communist upbringing, participants mentioned a readiness to campaign and, although no longer within a communist framework, many would still define themselves as activists. They did, however, admit to feeling wary of anything too political, something they associate with a childhood that was so very political. Cohen concluded that cradle communists, like himself, are less likely to seek the betterment of society through organized political parties. Participants' accounts confirm Cohen's conclusion, though there was a consensus that voting was vital, but barely anyone joined a political party. And this doesn't mean, of course, that they stopped caring. They, in Brahm's words, just can't stand party structures. Instead, they prefer to fight for a better society through single-issue pressure groups, like neighborhood committees or organizations such as Greenpeace or Amnesty International. All participants continue to class themselves as left-oriented. Many British participants vote for Labour or the Green Party, while Dutch participants generally vote for GroenLinks, Green Left, the Socialistische Partij, the SP, or even, interestingly enough, the Partij van de Arbeid, which is the Labour Party. Being concerned with international political and social issues, solidarity as well as the importance of voting are aspects respondents have taken from their upbringing and passed on to their children. And Sandra noted in this context, in terms of values, oh, my apologies, here we go. My upbringing taught me that if you want to get things done, you'll have to do them by the book. Try to be sensible. I have a lot of general knowledge about society. My brothers and sisters have the same. We all learned that from my parents. I try to raise my children with a certain set of social skills, and sometimes I blame myself that I raised them with too much social awareness. People compliment me on my children's social knowledge. They, my children, know what is happening in the world around them, end quote. Rachel, who was born in 1956 and grew up in London, stated something very similar. She said, in terms of values they passed on to me, values I pass on to my children, I try to make sure they question things and don't just accept things on face value. I haven't pushed a political line down their throats any more than my parents did with me. We debate things though. I would be horrified if my children would not feel the need to vote, because there are so many societies where one cannot vote. I don't feel they need to be active in a purely political sense, campaigning, etc. I would like to feel that they care about things sufficiently to make a point about these things, like the environment or unfair imprisonment. I think today there are far more, especially young people, involved in single cause campaigns or narrow focus politics, rather than being a member of the Labour Party. To me, it is important that my children feel they are part of society and that they are capable of changing society if they want or need to. End quote. So within the context of raising their own children, participants made some interesting remarks. The final question asked during the interview was, do you have the same values as your parent when it comes to raising your own children? The answers to this question were especially illuminating. Participants tended to be apologetic and understanding about their parents' choices and their own childhood in general. But through their children's upbringing, certain dissatisfactions or disappointments with their own upbringing came to the surface. Harry said, for example, my childhood was very complicated. I think I came out all right, though. I could have been very frustrated and blamed my parents for everything. I didn't. I think their main idea and view was all right. I took the positive things from my upbringing and passed them on to my children and learned from the things I didn't like about my childhood. I tried to give my children a lot of attention, end quote. Marxist concluded, based on the original Dutch sample, that the positive values of a communist upbringing outweighed the negative. Without denying the difficulties almost all participants experienced at different stages of their childhood, the same conclusion can be drawn from the British participants' testimonies. Overall, only a very small minority looked back in anger. British and Dutch participants agreed that they had a very special and different childhood, and that certain aspects of it were contradictory, frustrating, confusing, or incomprehensible. They recognized nonetheless that these difficulties were often caused by external factors, like the party, the Soviet Union, or the international climate, which is why they didn't hold their parents solely responsible for their negative experiences. As noted above, where participants elaborated on the positive aspects of their upbringing, they found it much more difficult to identify some of the negative aspects. And after some hesitation, some mentioned a lack of emotional attention, parental absence, or parents' overbearing personality. Interestingly, as time went by from the first interview in 2001 and the last in 2019, participants had become significantly more critical of their parents' choices and were more willing to share less pleasant sides of a communist upbringing. This is perhaps related to the fact that their parents are now long gone and they themselves are elderly. Many parents were still alive during the first round of interviews or had only just recently passed away. And additionally, over time, a trusting bond developed, and it is likely that participants felt safe to share more intimate and personal details about their lives. Finally, I had changed. In 2001, I was in my early 20s and still quite green. Since then, I've become a mother myself, which has influenced my thinking in more ways than I had ever imagined. The additional details my participants provided contributed to a more balanced picture of what it was like to grow up communist. And in line with Phil Cohen's observations, participants agreed that the communist movement didn't just take from its members, it also gave them a great deal in return. It provided a community, a value base, and attitudes towards life that have proven to be enduring. Now, for some concluding remarks, my book shows that the history of the international communist movement was not uniform. Though often defined by themselves and their adversaries by the relationship to the Soviet Union, national communisms were diverse and influenced by a nation's political, economic, and cultural characteristics. Yet, it would be too simplistic to suggest that there were only national communisms and that those communisms were stagnant over time. My book's 70-year-long view of the communist youth movement challenges how communism has been understood. Within its continuity, it shows that communism was constantly changing, as all social and political movements do. As the world changed, so did the communist movements and its members' expectations. Communism as an outlook was repeatedly reinvented by the movement's new or younger members. If communists from the 1920s, who so passionately believed that the revolution was imminent, were to find themselves in a room with communists from the 1970s, they would sharply disagree, and the first would most likely brand the latter reactionaries or renegades. But communists' ability to adjust their ideological views and expectations is also the reason why communism sustained itself in the West for most of the 20th century. My account distinguishes between ordinary rank and file communists and the cadre and the leadership, whose lives were far more internal than most local communists, and also between the public and private lives of communists. In public, communists may have looked uniform in their views and interpretations, but their children revealed that in the privacy of their homes, they expressed doubts and their actions regularly deviated from the official line. By allowing us an intimate look inside the communist home and into the movement as a whole, my participants provided us with an alternative view of what growing up communist was like. Within the privacy of the communist home, we find not only differences between communist experiences in Britain and the Netherlands, but also perceived differences among communists based on other identity markers. Rank and file communists were never just communists, though they have been portrayed as such because they shared the same encompassing worldview. Instead, they were diverse and had different needs and priorities. Aside from being a communist, they were also members of a nation, a social class, a gender group, a family, a local community, and a racial or ethnic group. Their allegiances to these groups and social constructs varied, and especially in the context of their family and their children's upbringing, these allegiances were sometimes more powerful than their allegiance to the party and the Soviet Union. Thank you so much for listening. Once again, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Also, if you are a credo-communist and would like to participate in my further research, please let me know. Thank you so much. Take care.